So thank you all so much for joining us here today. My name is Gabrielle Vance. I'm representing the Mountain Research Initiative here at the University of Bern in Bern, Switzerland. And I'm really happy to welcome you to the third lecture in our series in which we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Mountain Research Initiative Coordination Office, which was founded in 2001. And these lectures are really exciting. They feature research that has resulted from MRI funded synthesis workshops and also build capacity in the mountain research community. At the end of the lecture today, we'll give you information about the next one, which will be in September after a short summer pause. So we're really happy today to have Ignacio Palomo with us from Grenoble in France. Ignacio will share a new framework for assessing nature-based solutions that resulted in part from a MRI synthesis workshop that was held in 2019. Just to note that while the MRI synthesis workshop funding call for this year is closed, it's definitely something to keep in mind if you'd like to do similar research yourselves in the future. And I'll share more information about that as well later on. A few housekeeping items. Please be aware that this lecture is being recorded for later distribution. So please only turn on your camera or audio if you're okay with your image and or voice being recorded. And we hope we'll be quite interactive today. So we'll have a lecture from Ignacio and then a very open question and answer discussion. At any point throughout, please feel free to write questions in the chat, which looks like a text bubble at the bottom of your Zoom. There's also the option to raise your hand, which looks like a hand, which you can use during the Q&A if you'd like to ask your question live using video and audio. And we also have the Q&A feature, which looks like two text bubbles where you can write a question and other people can upvote it if they also have the same question. So please keep all of those options in mind. Thanks again for being here today. And thank you so much to our guest and invited speaker, Ignacio. I'll let you go ahead and tell us about your exciting research. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Gabriel, for the introduction. I'm Ignacio Palomo, and I'm based at the Laboratory of Alpine Ecology in Grenoble. And let me start by taking you to a trip to the mountains. More specifically to the Swiss Alps and to the Laureate Glacier, which is the largest glacier in the Alps. And it's also a glacier that's receding fast. It has lost around half of its surface and volume since 1850. So you can see me there skiing on the glacier in a very special trip to me, because it took place right after I attended the PhD defense of Emily Crusat, who was supervised by Sandra Laborel and Francis Tuckerboom. And I was on the glacier still thinking about the ecosystem service maps from Emily's thesis. And I was actually going to the Concordia hut, which is more or less around here in the picture. And back then I didn't know that I was going to experience my most direct encounter with climate change impacts. So I'll tell you how it went. So here you can see the Concordia hut, or better said, what was the Concordia hut in 1877. Back then you could actually reach the hut by walking from the glacier. But because of climate change, glacier receded and a stair had to be built so that actually mountaineers could reach it, and the stair had to be enlarged. So when we got to that point 6 years ago, there was a 150 elevation meters gap between the glacier and the hut. And that very direct physical encounter with climate change made me more aware of the impacts of my own activities, but also on the need to undertake transformative changes towards sustainability. And that's what we are going to be talking today about. So glacier retreat is something that is not only happening in the Alps. As you know, it's a global phenomenon that has been documented by multiple studies, and that photographers like Fabiano Ventura and others have been capturing in many parts of the world, like the Caucasus, Alaska, or Argentina. So after that experience with climate change, I decided to focus part of my research on mountain environments and how these are impacted by climate change. So I undertook a systematic literature review on how climate change was impacting ecosystem services. What I found out is that there is very diverse and large impact on multiple ecosystem services, from water availability and food production to regulating services such as regulation of extreme events, floods, or landslides, and also multiple cultural aspects related not only to aesthetics or mountain tourism, but also to spirituality, like, for example, related to local communities who live close to the glacier and because of glacier retreat are experiencing large impacts to the way of relating to the glacier and their spirituality. But the global environmental crisis that we live in today goes way beyond glaciers. As you can see in this graphic, which is part of the IPBES global assessment, and which was also published in the last issue of The Economist, you can see that the number of species that is threatened with extinction today is nearly around 1 million. And since since we started inhabiting the planet, these rates of extinctions are the largest that have existed. So it's rather a grim picture if you look about biodiversity and also thinking about nature's contributions to people, or NCPs. The picture is quite grim, right? Most of the NCPs are declining all over the planet. And this is what is happening now, but the impacts could be larger in the future. As it was nicely put by the drawer McKay cartoons, the impacts that we are witnessing now related to COVID-19 could be smaller than the ones that will be coming because of the economic recession, and maybe also smaller than the ones that some areas will experience because of climate change. So it's not positive news at all, as many of you already know. And some of the latest reports of the IPCC and IPBES have shown that unless we undertake transformative change, we won't be able to achieve many of the socio-environmental targets that we have already settled as society, such as the Sustainable Development Goals or the post-2020 biodiversity agenda that is being negotiated currently. And meanwhile, what we do is we keep on writing. We live still in a business as usual scenario. And just to provide you one fact, a recent study by Lorraine Whitmars and colleagues found out that climate change scientists are flying more on airplane than colleagues working in other disciplines. And if we speak about what scientists focus on in their research, and I'm talking now about scientists working on ecosystem services, or NCPs, what we found out in this work coordinated by Berta Martin Lopez, that studied how the different components of the IPBES conceptual framework were studied in different publications. We found out that among those components of the framework that you can see in the picture, institutional responses were the least studied. And that's quite worrisome because institutional responses, not only they are at the center of the best conceptual framework, and they occupy that place because of their fundamental role in managing interactions between other elements, but also because they are the ones that are most needed to undertake the transformative change that we need to go through. So all that made me a little bit frustrated when I saw this picture. And you may remember a couple of months ago when the Ever Given was stuck in the Canal of Suez. And it made me thought a lot the fact that because of COVID-19, last year, CO2 emissions were only reduced by 6-7%. Even at the moment of the highest confinements, when China was still confined at the end of it, Europe was in the middle of their confinement, and the United States were starting their confinement. At that point of time, CO2 emissions were only reduced by 17%. So, of course, we need to undertake individual lifestyle changes, but there is much more that needs to be done. So, where to start with? A good point to do that is again from the IPBES Global Assessment, Chapter 5, that identified a series of levers and leverage points that can be activated in order to undertake transformative changes. And I'm going to focus on 3 different points here, which are those that relate to values, those that relate to equity, and those that relate to investment, before going later on the framework to assess transformative change that Gabriel mentioned at the beginning. So, as you know, nature-based solutions are the actions to protect, restore, or sustainably manage nature in order to provide biodiversity co-benefits and maintain human well-being. And nature-based solutions are gaining significant traction in science and policy. However, we still don't know yet what's their real potential for transformative change. So let's talk first about values. And as you know, probably from the work of the late Georgina Mays, values around conservation have shifted in the last decades. And therefore, nature-based solutions can be framed, designed, and implemented according to different values. Either intrinsic values, as was the predominant discourse in the 60s and the 70s, instrumental values, as it was mostly predominant at the beginning of the new millennia in the framing of nature for people, or as relational values or visions of people and nature living in harmony, which is gaining importance in the last years. So, of course, nature-based solutions could be framed around any of these 3 different typologies of values. And as it has been nicely put by the work of Belden and colleagues, recent framings of nature-based solutions, like, for example, that of the global standard for nature-based solutions of the IUCN, has tried to emphasize mostly instrumental values. And of course, that's valuable, for example, to bring in different stakeholder typologies to the table, as could be, for example, the private sector. And we would speak a little bit on that later. It also may leave aside other types of values, such as relational values or a morality of care and stewardship to nature, which is ultimately needed for transformative change. So it's very important that when we frame nature-based solutions and design and implement them, that we are aware of the values that are underpinning their narratives and implementation. And what about the funding level? A recent research found out that we need at least the triple of the current funding in order to reach environmental targets. And it's not only the amount of funding that is important, but also the percentage that comes from different sources. And when we look at the private capital, it's very shocking to see that there is so little contribution from private companies. And this calls for the creation of new markets so that private companies can really participate in the creation and upscaling of nature-based solutions that are beneficial for biodiversity and for people. And you may think that the COVID-19 brings an opportunity in order to direct investment towards green policies. And of course, that's right. But so far, it seems that it's not happening. Only 17% of the funds that relate to the COVID-19 recovery are targeting green measures. So that's also an alarming fact and something that we really need to change and try to redirect towards green policies such as nature-based solutions. And finally, the third point I wanted to make in relation to equity refers to one type of NBS, in this case, a REDD+ program, which is the largest program to reduce deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries. And that was criticized at the beginning for not sufficiently incorporating local communities and equity aspects. So let me show you quickly how the REDD+ program works in its third phase, because the first and the second focus on capacity building. But on the third phase, a particular country or area, if it reduces deforestation, it would receive a certain amount of funds, and therefore more carbon would be stored. So previous research already showed that if we include biodiversity as allocation criteria, there won't be big losses in terms of efficiency in how much carbon forests are storing. So we decided to ask what would happen if we include also equity as an allocation criteria for the distribution of funds. So we built a multi-objective optimization model and assessed the synergies and the trade-offs among 3 different sustainable development goals. So what we found out here is that if we include equity considerations in a moderate extent, such as 25% here, there won't be much losses in terms of efficiency related to carbon storage and species conservation. And the outcomes would be very different. So they would actually shift from what you see to the left, which is the countries that would receive the funds if we focus only on maximizing carbon storage, to what we see in the center when the funds aim to maximize biodiversity conservation, or what you see to the right when equity is included as a criteria for the distribution of funds. And actually, this completely different distribution of the funds could help many countries close the implementation gap that they have to close to actually start participating within this program. Another examples on how to include social justice in relation to nature-based solutions comes from the city of Birmingham, who assessed ecosystem services vulnerability, or the ratio between demand and supply, and design a program to implement nature-based solutions in those areas which had the lower supply and the highest demand. But if we want to assess transformative change, there is some challenges we need to solve first. One of those is that the majority of MBS, or here, for example, a subtype of MBS, ecosystem-based adaptation, do not report on outcome indicators. So we know that NBS are in general positive for biodiversity and human well-being if they are properly designed. But we don't know certain things, like, for example, how much a flood would be reduced if a forest is restored along a river. So there is still a gap on the evidence base that we have. And when we speak about single variables, it's easier to close that gap. in this very interesting publication that came out only 1 month ago, Girardin and colleagues found out that in relation to temperature increase, nature-based solutions could reduce the peak of that temperature by 0.1 degrees or 0.3, depending if we are in a trajectory of 1.5 or 2 degrees increase since pre-industrial levels. But there is many more things that temperature. When we talk about NBS, there is aspects of biodiversity co-benefits, ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem services provided, and human well-being. So it's actually very challenging to measure what transformative change is. So what we did, and as Gabriel mentioned at the beginning, with the support of the Mountain Research Initiative Knowledge Synthesis Workshops, we assessed the database of Panorama, which is a global initiative by the IUCN and GIZ and other partners that documents solutions to the global environmental crisis globally. And we focused only in mountain systems because, as we said at the beginning, these are highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. And also because in mountain systems, there is a large number of NBS that are being implemented. So with that in mind, we were able to identify 93 different NBS implemented globally. So 93 successful cases of NBS in the platform. And as you can see here, those NBS were implemented mostly in middle-income countries, and they responded to different challenges like land degradation, poverty, governance, and climate change, and many other specific challenges, as you can see in the slide. So how shall we measure transformative change? What we did here is to create a conceptual framework building on previous frameworks from the literature. And first, you can see in the upper left part, different challenges that were addressed by NBS and different outcomes: biodiversity, NCPs, and good quality of life, which are all components from the IPBES conceptual framework. In the center, you can see the components of nature-based solutions, which we adapted from the so-called 3 spheres of transformation by O'Brien and Signa, which identified the personal, political, and practical dimensions of change, which in relation to nature-based solutions, they relate to different aspects such as knowledge, values, and worldviews from the personal sphere, rules, instruments, economic incentives, or legislation from the political sphere, and finally, technology, ecosystem management, and behaviors from the practical sphere. And then the last part of the framework, which we borrow from the work of Fedele et al., refers to how a social ecological system changes as a result of the implementation of a nature-based solution. And that change can be captured and measured in different ways. That include, for example, changes in path shifting of different variables within the social ecological system, restructuration of ecological or social aspects, multi-scale or innovative elements, and then system-wide and persistent components. So let me take you very briefly through what are the most common elements within these 93 successful nature-based solutions. From the personal sphere, we found that intrinsic and instrumental values were present in the majority, most often in combination. And that there were different types of knowledge also combined in nature-based solutions, because there were, for example, knowledge from local communities combined with knowledge from people working at the university or technical knowledge. From the political sphere, there was a large amount of community engagement in many different forms, either participation, capacity building, or awareness raising. Actually, the average number of stakeholder typologies that participated in its nature-based solution was 4, which is relatively high. And then finally, from the practical sphere, what we found out is that ecosystem management practices, such as restoration, biodiversity monitoring, or reduced pressure, were common also in the majority of MBS. We also developed a classification of nature-based solutions that were implemented in different contexts to respond to different risks, and that you can check in a publication that was published last month with these results. And just to make things a little bit more tangible, let me go very quickly through this case in the Peruvian Andes, where a community was experiencing increasing climate change impacts in the forms of decreased water availability and increased fire risk. So in this case, the local community, in collaboration with the university professors, were able to study the system and to decide to put a series of measures in place that included the restoration of vegetation around small wetlands to increase water filtration, and also the restoration of ancient water channels to improve water transport. So as a result of these changes, there was increased water availability, there were reduced fire risks, and of course, new patterns in the ecological network and the social stakeholders network that made this nature-based solution function and deliver ecosystem services that were needed in the area. So to conclude with this part, the first message is that we need to act now to undertake transformative change. There is a short window of opportunity, not only in the mountains, but all over the planet. That evaluating transformative change is increasingly complex when we move from approaches that assess only one variable to evaluating transformative change around other aspects such as MBS, and that our framework enhances our understanding of the links between the design, implementation, and outcomes of nature-based solutions. But let me now take you again briefly to a mountain environment, and more specifically to the Mont Blanc Massif, where I took this picture just a few weeks ago. And here, as we said at the beginning, climate change impacts are occurring very rapidly, right? Mountains are warming faster than lowland areas. And it is estimated that mountains in the Northern Hemisphere have increased the temperature by 2 degrees, which is nearly twice the temperature increase of the average land surface. So a recent study found out that among different climbing routes in the Mont Blanc Massif, the large majority of them have been affected by climate change, and they had to be climbed earlier in the season or only in winter. And some of them have been greatly affected, and a few of them, 3 of them, had actually disappeared and could not be climbed anymore. And these changes that we can see in the mountains, and I always say that mountaineers have a moral obligation to communicate climate change because impacts are so tangible. They have cascading effects in the lower parts of the watershed. So that cascading effects from the upper to the lower parts of watershed made me and a few colleagues put together a project that is called Pathways of Transformation in the Alps, and in which we have different objectives, which, as you can see here, they include mapping and analyzing the implementation of nature-based solution, assessing potential location bias, and the outcomes for biodiversity, climate change adaptation, ecosystem services, and good quality of life. Assessing the biophysical and social elements that underpin nature-based solutions for transformative change. upscaling through future scenarios, the widespread use and implementation of nature-based solutions to achieve different SDGs, and then finally showcasing best practice examples to exchange, learn, and replicate. So in general, we're working with different MBS outcomes related to mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity, and NCPs, with a focus on upscaling and transformative change, and with various methodologies that include a database, spatial analysis, and interviews and workshops. And here you can see a map of the 97 different NVS implemented within the area of the Alpine Convention that we have identified and mapped, and that we have started to analyze. And some of the first results that we have obtained is that NBS are not necessarily located strategically, considering different climate change risks. For example, our preliminary results show that NBS that aim to focus in increase of temperature tend to be located in areas where temperature will increase the most. However, NVS that aim to reduce the impacts of flooding seem to be located in areas that have lower flooding risk in the future. And when we talk about other climate events such as drought, heat waves, snow cover, and fires, NBS seem to be located in areas that do not necessarily have higher risks in relation to these variables. Another result that we identified within the project is that it's necessary to be aware of trade-offs. And as you know, NBS are usually framed within a narrative of co-benefits for biodiversity and for people, but that's not always the case. And within this study, we found that there may be different trade-offs emerging in relation to the different SDGs, and particularly in relation to SDGs 8, 9, and 11 that focus on growth, infrastructure, and sustainable cities. And this made clear that a careful design and implementation is very much needed in order to avoid different trade-offs that may emerge. So here there is a screenshot of the website of the project, and you can see in the map some of the initiatives that we have already identified. So if you go to the website, you can actually click in any of the initiatives, and a new window will pop up, and you will be able to read more details about any of those and the impacts that it's already having on the ground. So I invite you to go there and check different initiatives if you are interested. So here's a few references of the work, and that's all for now. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And I'll be glad to take any questions you may have.
Thanks, Ignacio. I was just dropping the link to Portal in the chat for everyone in case they'd like to check it out right now. So go ahead and give that a peek. And also we have some more information about the publication you mentioned. So thank you so much. It's really cool to get to hear about such cutting edge research in this context. And we really hope that this will be quite interactive today. So I definitely have a lot of questions that I wrote down, and maybe some of my colleagues who are also here from the MRI Coordination Office do too, but we'd really like to first open it up to the attendees. So again, your options are to, if you have a question, write it in the chat, raise your hand if you'd like to ask it, and then I can unmute you, turn on your video, and also the Q&A option if you would like to write a question and other people can vote on the same one. So please feel very free. I know there's a lot of information in a relatively short time, so plenty of things we can explore in greater detail.
Yes. I know it's a lot of information in a short time, but I was just contacted last week by a person from Leuphana University who is coordinating a blog which is called Ideas for Sustainability, which is a blog I really much recommend everyone. And they're gonna publish a blog post on this article next week. So
okay.
if you are interested in knowing more about this work, um, the details will be there in the blog post and the publication itself.
Any questions from any of the attendees?
Some of the attendees I know, so I have already discussed with them some of the things of this publication. So, well, maybe there is one question.
Hi.
Yeah, there's Lucia.
I'm gonna make this a little bit more participatory, I guess. Yeah, so the other day I was in a conference and they were talking about how maybe MBS solutions, even if they need this bottom-up approach, they will need a lot of, let's say, guidance from experts. And in the risk of there may be like some naive decisions which don't understand like consequences or negative impacts. And maybe like top-down solutions will be needed, or will we need to, yeah, and this will maybe like came into contradiction with giving power to institutions or to, yeah, some more powerful like UN or, yeah. So maybe what's your thought on this? And because you also explain about different stakeholders and their importance. And
yes, thanks, Lucia. It's a great question. I think that finding the balance is very difficult. Of course, when we face global challenges, we need global institutions that have more power and that can create a binding legislation. So we need more of that. But of course, it's true that bottom-up approaches have very large impacts, and that ultimately bottom-up approaches have in history led to profound transformative changes. So if you think, for example, on revolutions. So we need to combine both, and I guess the balance is very, very delicate. But my perception is that in general, there should be much more participation. Besides the study that we did within this set of 93 NBS, in which participation was very common, I think in other areas, participation is not so common. And research has already shown that participation in environmental conservation increases the effectiveness of environmental solutions in the long term. So finding the mechanisms to engage decision makers and the public in initiatives like NVS from the very beginning, I think is very much needed for conservation. Right, and there is multiple co-benefits of that, from increasing environmental awareness of those who participate, to a better fit to the different contexts where MBS are located. So yes, there is a need for both, but I think more participation is very much needed.
thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? I know I was wondering several things, one of which was, how do you see essential climate variables, or specifically essential mountain climate variables or essential mountain biodiversity variables, fitting in with your framework?
Like, for example, which essential variables do you mean, like altitude, temperature, or ecosystem type? Well, they are, of course, very important. We didn't focus much on how this impacted the outcomes of MBS, because despite we had a large data set, we didn't have enough power to compare across different altitudes or ecosystem types or temperature. But of course, the context could be different. So yes, I guess we need to, of course, consider them. And they may be influencing the outcomes, of course, in different ways. So it's not the same an MBS that aims to, for example, increase resilience of agriculture to droughts and climate change, in which the individual who is farming must have a leading role in implementing that, or usually has, because it has a private interest on that, than when you are implementing another MBS in relation to, for example, reduced flooding, which is a much larger scale MBS that has to be implemented by a region or a series of municipalities. So yes, all these variables influence the design of the MBS at the end.
Thank you. Lucia, do you still have a question, or is your hand just still up? If you have another question, that's fine.
I think I just pressed it and then, okay.
Oh, that's fine. If anyone else? Oh, okay, James. I'm sure it's another question about essential variables, perhaps. Okay, go ahead, James.
Yeah, hi, I'm a colleague of Gabrielle in the MRI Coordination Office. I was wondering, how would you address the challenge that for something like flooding, for instance, this is an extremely rare event, and it can be difficult to sort of quantify the benefit of any intervention, whether it be nature-based or not, over the relatively short times it may prevent a flood or reduce the impacts of a flood with a very low annual probability. How do you address this sort of challenge, I suppose, in demonstrating the impact of something which may only sort of come into effect in very extreme events?
Yes. Thanks, James. Great question. Yes, that's what exactly I was referring to in relation to the evidence-based knowledge gap that there is actually in relation to MBS. And in this work, we use the description of solution providers. So the stakeholders that implemented the nature-based solution in the different case studies, they reported what were the outcomes in terms of biodiversity conservation or ecosystem services. And they mentioned things, for example, there was in certain cases more sightings of a particularly interesting species in a protected area, or there were increased flows of water in areas that were dealing with drought. So we had to rely on those descriptions for this study. But yes, I agree that having more quantitative and real-time and future scenarios on how these variables change it's important.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I decided there's not that many of us, so I'm just going to allow everyone to talk, so you don't have to raise your hand. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask. So we should all have talking permissions now. Another thing I was wondering about, the graph with analyzing equity, I have to confess, I didn't understand what it meant with percent equity. Could you explain that in a little more detail? Perhaps other people have the same question.
Yes, of course. So when we included the equity as an allocation criteria, let me see if I can share this again. When you distribute the funds, you could distribute either all of them, considering the equity criteria, or only part of them. Mm-hmm. So in this graph, what you can see is how carbon emissions and biodiversity conservation change when you distribute 20% of the funds according to the equity criteria, and
Okay.
the 75% of the remaining funds, you distribute them according to biodiversity and carbon criteria. So the 100% here means that all funds are distributed only considering equity aspects. So we used two different approaches to equity. One was the egalitarian approach, and in that scenario, all countries would receive the same amount of funds. And then the max-min approach, which tries to provide the largest amount of funds to those countries that need them the most. And for that, we use as a proxy the level of poverty in each country. So in that other scenario, only equity would be considered as well in this 100%, but the poorer countries would receive a largest amount of funds.
Thank you. Other questions for Ignacio? And anyone, you should just be able to unmute if you like. The chat or Q&A are also open. I know my colleague Grace is here from the MRI Coordination Office as well. And in our communications, I know she typically asks people about surprising or unexpected aspects of their research. And I was specifically wondering, with these, there were 93 case studies, were there any that you were just shocked that were like sleepers, like how could this have worked? This is so surprising or unexpected that this was successful after all.
Yes, thanks for the question. Not any particular that I remember now, but I was surprised to find so many different ways of participation, not only community engagement in the form of awareness raising, in the form of advisory committees, in the form of transparent sharing of information, in the form of including facilitators to work with local communities. So this very large amount of participation and the participation of different stakeholder typologies, private sector, public sector from the local, regional and national scales, NGOs, universities. So all this combination of factors is something that I did not expect at the beginning. And I think it's a core ingredient why all these initiatives seem to be working so well.
Thank you. Okay, well, while we wait to see if anyone else has an urgent question, I will go ahead and share in the chat the link to the next lecture in the MRI 20th Anniversary Series, which will be on September 29th. And in it, my colleague, James Thornton, who was here earlier and asked about flooding, will share another recent paper about trying to define at least a preliminary list of essential mountain climate variables. So it will probably be of interest to those who came today. So I've shared the link for that with everyone in the chat, and I'll include it in an email as well. I also want to remind everyone that we will send you a recording of the lecture and a PDF of the slides for additional follow-up and an evaluation as well. Any other questions? Several of the attendees are your students, isn't that right?
Well, yes, I also wanted to thank especially Tituan, Lucia, who are part of the project, and some of the results I presented before, but also Emily is participating actively in the project, and other colleagues I'm also working with them in one way or another.
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to be a question, but also if you're involved and have something to add, feel free.
Seems it's okay now.
Okay. well, I did have just one more. If you could explain in a little more detail about the process of the development of the framework, starting with the synthesis workshop up until this paper that just came out.
Yes, that's a great question. So the framework was built in a top-down and bottom-up way because we use the descriptions provided by what is called the solution providers. So by reading all these NVS and the information they contained, we started developing a framework with the elements that we were able to analyze. But also it was top-down because going into the scientific literature on what variables and dimensions need to be considered in order to assess transformative change, we were able to identify different elements. So this combination of top-down and bottom-up allow us to have broad framework that was suitable to this particular dataset. And then we presented some preliminary results to the participants of the workshop, and we discussed these different variables. We tested them in a few case studies to see how they work. And yes, and then later through the months, things change, of course, like they always do in research and in many other things in life. So we changed the first plan of analyzing just a few solutions to analyzing all these 93 from Panorama. And eventually we were able to condense everything in one publication that came out last month. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, last call for any other questions before we wrap up today's lecture. Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Ignacio, for sharing your research. We really appreciate it. And I hope you'll all join for the next lecture in the series on September 29th. And again, stay tuned for an email with evaluation recording all the information that you need. So thanks everyone and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.